Afternoon, everyone. I'm Hutch Hussain, Senior Manager of Government Engagement at the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, and known to many of you affectionately as the Brotherhood or BSL, and many of you have a lifetime of dropping off donations to our op shops, and today is really about making sure you know more broadly about what the Brotherhood does, and that's what today's and this week's expo here at Parliament House is. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're on today, in which we work and live, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to the many diverse Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who live, work and contribute to the culture of this community. Thank you all for being here today. I won't individually acknowledge all the MPs or VIPs in the room today, as that would probably take the full hour that we've got. But thank you all for being here on this important topic. I also want to thank everyone who's joined us today and is willingly standing for the next hour, pretending they're out of politics in the pub by leaning on the bar tables that we have. We also have some small sandwich platters for lunch and some tasty desserts. But if we do run out, just know that that's part of our deliberate plan to give you a sense of what it's like to live in poverty. That's my bad mum's joke. I promise there won't be any more. Today's topic is partnering for a poverty-free Australia and Victoria. It's an important one and actually the theme of our expo here. So if you haven't had a chance, please do check out the displays that are on my left and our historical timeline from our work over the past 90 years on my right. Today's panel, who I'll introduce shortly, will canvass the key impacts of our state, with 13% of Victorians currently living in poverty, and what that means when the rates are the highest in regional and rural Australia and Victoria. To strive towards the eradication of poverty across Victoria, the Brotherhood recognises the importance of partnering with government, the business sector, workers and the broader community sector. This panel will bring together leading voices to discuss what's needed, how we can get there, and who else needs to be involved. But before we get to the panel, I want to introduce one of the key Victorian ministers with courage of ensuring we minimise the impacts of poverty in Victoria. And shortly, and just before I introduce Lizzie, I just want to provide a brief background. Lizzie is a member of the Victorian Legislative Council, representing the Western Metropolitan Region since November 2022, and previously served as a member for Pascoe Vale between November 2014 and November 2022. She now has one of the longest portfolio titles in this building, so be patient as I explain that she's now the Deputy Leader of the Government in the Legislative Council, Minister for Disability, Ageing and Carers, Minister for Child Protection and Family Services. Can you please put your hands together for Lizzie Blanthorne?
Thanks very much, Hutch, and it's great to be here with you today. And thank you very much for that welcome. And it is indeed a long title, which is in so many respects synonymous with the topic that we are here to talk about today. It was with great honour and privilege when the Premier asked me to be responsible for all of those portfolios. The one thing that they all have in common is vulnerable people. And so it was indeed the reason that I got involved in politics, was in order to stand up for those that needed help with a voice. So it was a great privilege to accept that very long mouthful of a title. Can I also acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Can I also acknowledge Minister Ben Carroll, who is here today with another long list of portfolios that also are fairly synonymous with the ones that we are here to talk about. Can I also acknowledge Travis McLeod, Executive Director of the Brotherhood, Emma King from VCOS and Danielle Wood from the Grattan Institute. And I'm sure you are in for a treat and indeed robust discussion on this panel this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you because events like this one are indeed so very important in giving us both the opportunity to come together and talk about these issues, but also to look at how we can better connect and cooperate to reduce and ultimately, hopefully, to eliminate poverty here in Victoria. The Andrews Labor government has an ambitious agenda on equality and on inclusion, and partnership is a critical element in achieving results. We can't do it alone. We are leading the nation in treaty and truth-telling processes which will help set Victoria on a path of justice and reconciliation. We are partnering with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, investing in the most recent budget $140 million over 4 years to improve outcomes for First Nations children. We know that Indigenous children, First Peoples children, are overrepresented in our child protection system, and that the deeper you go into the system, the worse those statistics become. So investing this money and empowering, enabling ACCOs to deliver services for these children and families is so important. Through the big housing build, we continue to deliver new social and affordable housing. As of May 2023, we have 7,600 social and affordable homes in planning or in construction. And we are also spending $134 million on critical access to housing and homelessness supports across our state. We provide concessions and we provide grants to many Victorians to assist with the cost of their day-to-day utilities. And we have instituted a second round of the $250 power saving bonus. We've more than tripled family services funding since 2012-13 to more than $398 million per year in 2023-24. And we have consistently backed our diverse multicultural communities and our LGBTIQ communities. I don't have to tell anybody in this room that the issues that we're here to talk about today are complex. They're complex in that they have intersecting factors that make someone more vulnerable to poverty, their socioeconomic and housing status, historical injustice and discrimination, ongoing injustice and discrimination, age, disability, gender identity, sexual orientation are amongst the many intersecting factors that can make these problems complex. And there is also the current economic situation, with cost of living pressures continuing to push many households and many families and many individuals into poverty. As a government, we do not accept poverty as an inevitable feature of our society. Our programs, our policies, our services and supports all come from our unerring belief that together, in partnership, we can dismantle the social barriers that inhibit people from achieving their full potential, that inhibit people from living with dignity. We recognise that a poverty-free Victoria is no easy task, and that it will take the input and involvement of all levels of government, the community services sector, together with our communities, if we are to make effective and lasting change. These partnerships are critical to continuing to identify common objectives and collectively prioritise reform and investment. Working to eliminate poverty is a complex goal that demands a twofold response: acute on-the-ground support and services, and medium to long-term systemic reform to build a better, more target support system that reaches all Victorians that are in need. It's a goal that is achievable, and one that we must collectively remain committed to at all levels of government and across the community sector more broadly. Coming together like this to share our knowledge, to share our ideas and experiences is indeed a very important part of that process. So I thank you for the opportunity to say a few words today, and I very much look forward to the panel's discussion, and I thank you all and wish you the best for the rest of the day and the rest of the week here in Queen's Hall. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Blanthorne, and the state is fortunate to have someone of your passion and calibre in that role with the big agenda ahead, and we're really pleased to hear that we share the objective that a poverty-free Victoria is possible and not necessarily an inevitable outcome, and definitely an achievable goal. So thank you for your work. As I said, our topic and the questions that I'll be asking this panel is around how do we partner for a poverty-free Victoria. It's not something that government can do alone. And so you'll have a chance to ask some questions at your end, so store them up before I get to the end. It's now my task to introduce the panellists. Now, I don't know what the collective noun is for a group of eminent panellists, but if there was one, this would be it. Firstly, we have Danielle Wood to my left. Danielle is the CEO of the Grattan Institute, where she heads a team of leading policy thinkers, researching and advocating policy to improve the lives of Australians. She also leads Grattan's Budgets and Government program and has published extensively on economic reform priorities, budgets, tax reform, women's workforce participation, generational inequality and reforming political institutions. She's a sought-after media commentator and speaker on policy issues and a member of the Australian Government's Women's Economic Equality Task Force, the Parliamentary Budget Office Expert Advisory Committee and Commonwealth Bank CEO Advisory Council, and frankly I don't know when she sleeps. Please welcome Danielle. Next is Emma King, CEO of VCOS. Emma joined VCOS as the CEO in 2013, providing a strong voice of leadership and advocacy on social justice issues for the community sector. She was previously the CEO of the Early Learning Association, formerly Kindergarten Parents Victoria, the peak organisation representing parents and providers of early childhood services, learning services across Australia. Emma has an extensive background in the public sector and workforce and education issues, having worked as a Victorian policy advisor, teacher and in a range of industrial and training roles at the Victorian Independent Education Union and the Finance Sector Union. And she's also just recently been awarded a King's Birthday Order of Australia, so please congratulate and welcome Emma. Last but not least is my boss, Trav McLeod.
Definitely not least.
Trav joined BSL in April 22 from the Centre for Policy Development, an independent Australian policy institute he led as CEO for 8 years and remains connected with as a senior fellow. He began his career in public law, working for the State Solicitor's Office in Western Australia and for Justice Michael Kirby in the High Court. Travis is an Oxford Rhodes Scholar and also worked as a policy advisor for the Martin School at the University of Oxford, playing a leading role in their 2013 report, Now for the Long Term. He's the author of Rule of Law in War, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2015, and he's just here as a token male on our panel today. Please welcome all the panellists. We're going to be sharing the 2 microphones on this panel, on this intimate stage. So let's kick off and focus initially on what are the drivers and the impacts of poverty and influence at a state government level. I'm going to start with Emma, but just before I do, earlier this year, as the media ramped up their focus on the cost of living, the pressures around the country, Emma made an important point in an op-ed that she did about there's a difference between people generally in the population that are facing cost of living pressures, which means, whether they reduce the number of dinners they have out versus the people who are living below the poverty line who are choosing whether to have dinner at all and having to face that choice about going without. So my first question to Emma is, we know that 1 in 8 Victorians live in poverty. Can you tell us who's most at risk of poverty and what are the most pressing issues that those households are experiencing?
Thanks so much for your question, Hutch, and if I can also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today. When it comes to looking, as you say, at the most pressing issues, VCOS we've got poverty maps, I should say, if you jump onto our website. So we worked with NatSem to look at what is the state of poverty across the state of Victoria, and probably unsurprisingly, but also horrifyingly, you can see that poverty exists in every town, every city, every suburb, every corner of Victoria. One of the things that we know, and you can see through their interactive poverty maps, is it looks different in different communities. So in some places like Carlton, it's much more single person households, younger. Other places it will be older women over 55, etc. As Hutch mentioned in your opening, Hutch, we know that when we look at those flashpoint times, and we're definitely seeing one of those now, and we come to looking at the cost of really food, fuel, energy, electricity, we know that it impacts everyone, but as you said, it doesn't impact in the same way. So for some people, those costs going up, it's an annoyance, it's an inconvenience, it definitely might have an impact. As you say, you go out to dinner less often, you might have to drop something off the list. But for others, it's the difference between can you afford food to eat. making so-called choices that no one should have to make about do you heat or do you eat? Do you buy medication? Or if you even get to go to the doctor and you find a bulk billing doctor, can you afford to fill a script afterwards to get your medication? So there's really, it's pretty dire in how it plays out. So we're seeing a real issue there. The other thing that I'd really point to, sorry, I know this is echoing a little bit, is where we see pockets of entrenched disadvantage, and we've seen that's through not only the evidence that VCOS has done, but others like be it the Brotherhood, the Jesuits dropping off the Edge report, for example, where we can see areas of communities where there has been entrenched disadvantage over periods of time. And I know we'll talk about this a bit later, but really interested in place-based approaches, because I think the thing that our poverty map shows, and the other work that others have done, is we need those systemic levers, whether that be lifting the rate of job seeker, for example, that needs to shift. We saw actually poverty alleviated for a short period of time during COVID because the rate was doubled. And then at the same time, what are the place-based initiatives? And we know the research is in, we know what we have to do, we just have to look at actually how do we do that and how do we address it.
Thank you. That's a good segue to Danielle. That's your cue to pass on the microphone to Danielle. Danielle, tell us about what are the economic factors that are currently impacting poverty and inequality, and what are some of the biggest drivers?
I think there's many important drivers of the overall state of inequality. One that often actually we don't think about is just what I call gross income differentials. So we actually have very wide variance in incomes in Australia by international standards. I think we're actually the second highest in the OECD, and that reflects big differences between people that are very high income earners, mining, construction, and workers at the lower end, like the care sector, where we pay very poorly. The second thing that then feeds in is the tax and transfer system, which we rely on to try and address some of those gross income differentials. It is quite effective in Australia. We're quite good at bringing down inequality via taxes and transfers. But what we are not good at, which Emma has pointed to, is alleviating poverty for those that are most vulnerable. So the reason that we have such high poverty rates is because people on those working age welfare payments, like job seeker, like single parenting payments, like disability payments, are well below the poverty line. So that is the kind of the policy choice element. The third driver I would point to is housing. And this has been a very slow burn, but we have not delivered housing markets that are good at providing affordable and secure tenure. For now 30 or so years, house prices and incomes have diverged. That has led to a world where home ownership rates have plummeted amongst young people, but particularly poorer young people. So if we went back to the 1980s, someone in the bottom 20% of income earners, aged 25 to 34-year-old, had a 60% chance of owning a house. Today, that is less than 20%. So that is an extraordinary change. And what that means for that group of people is probably they won't own a house in their lifetime. So through all their life stages, starting a family, hitting retirement, they will be in the rental market. We know that people in the rental market are much more likely to be experiencing housing stress. That is particularly acute right now with what's going on with rents, which have increased almost 20% in the past year, extraordinary increases that people are trying to cope with. And on top of that, the insecurity that comes with renting. So even though we have some of the better or more pro-tenant housing laws in Victoria than other states, there is still a high degree of insecurity associated with renting. And the final point I will come to, which goes to Emma's point around entrenched disadvantage, it's around the failure of the levers that we would normally rely on to make sure we don't see poverty transmitted from generation to generation. So I'm talking particularly about education here. What we would hope to see is education is a leveller, but what we see actually is educational gaps between students from advantaged and disadvantaged parents are widening as they progress through the school system. That is, obviously we can talk about school funding, but it is much more than funding. It's about the way we set up our schools for success. And at the moment, schools in disadvantaged areas are falling behind on a number of levers, and therefore those students are not getting that boost up that they should be through the education system. So I think all of those things together contribute to what we see the current picture in terms of both inequality but also poverty.
Thanks very much for that overview, Danielle. Trav, you're a member of the Interim Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee to the Federal Government that provided advice on measures to reduce economic disadvantage ahead of this year's federal budget. What were some of the key recommendations that you and the committee raised that could be acted on at a state level?
Well, thanks, Hutch. And can I just say before I answer that question how wonderful it is to have you all here and part of the exhibition of BSL's history and the breadth and depth of our services across the life course today and our policy and research work. So thank you. I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff and volunteers at BSL, and call out Uncle John Baxter, who's one of our First Nations staff members, a cultural ambassador for the organisation, who's here with us today. And can I also thank Emma and Danny. Danny's just off a plane from the United States. It's her second event today. So thank you very much for being with us, Danny. And Emma, wonderful recognition last week of all of your work for the community sector and for people experiencing poverty and disadvantage. So thank you. To Hutch's question, so the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee was established by the Federal Treasurer and Social Services Minister last December. And it's a group of people from across the community sector, business, unions, experts in disadvantage and social security payments. We released our first report just before the budget, and a number of the recommendations were as relevant to state and local government as they are to the federal government. So the 5 themes that the committee focused on in its first report, the first one was, and it's been mentioned by Danny, was the adequacy of income support and rent assistance. And the finding was that against any objective measure, current base rates of those payments are wholly inadequate. And there were some recommendations made about lifting the adequacy of those payments so that people don't fall further into poverty and disadvantage because of the payment levels they receive through income support. The second set of recommendations, and I can see the Employment Minister here, Ben Carroll, was around a broader and more ambitious full employment target and substantial reform to our employment services systems at various levels, federal and state. So we do have historically low unemployment, around 3.6%, but we still have nearly 1 million Australians that are part of the Workforce Australia system. And the data from the Victorian Department suggests there's about 600,000 Victorians that want to work or want to work more. And the committee found that this is the time to focus on building much more sustainable pathways to economic participation for those job seekers who are marginalised in the labour market and working directly with employers. The third was around what Emma mentioned, which was places and communities of known entrenched disadvantage. And it goes to your point, Minister, thank you for the opening, around the systems change that is required to rewire investment and services that are better connected and empower local communities to find the best solutions to those issues of entrenched disadvantage. It's interesting, the poorest 20% of households in Australia compared to the richest 20% of households. For people in the poorest 20% of households, you're 9 times more likely to have an unpaid carer in that household. You're 7 times more likely to have somebody in that household who's experienced homelessness and unemployment. And that requires bold reforms from federal and state governments. The fourth was around ending parts of our service system that compound disadvantage for families and for children. And so that was around the activity test for the childcare subsidy and pernicious programs like Parents Next that punish parents, particularly single parents. And that's why it's terrific to see the investment into the early years, particularly from the Victorian government. And the last one was around ambition. So 1 in 8 people in Australia, in Victoria in poverty, 13% nationally, was a recommendation around legislative measures and targets to permanently reduce poverty and disadvantage out to 2030. There are countries like Canada, New Zealand, others that have really set an ambition to permanently reduce the numbers of people in poverty and disadvantage, and we said, well, why not Australia? Because the Minister's right, it shouldn't be inevitable, but the numbers are still far too high for a wealthy country like Australia.
Thanks, Trav. I guess building on Trav's response, Emma and Danielle, if you could jump in. We know that the federal government controls the levers around social security and income support. What role can the Victorian government play in Victoria free of poverty?
Just kicking off, I think there's a few things that we've seen Victoria, and we've seen Victoria leading the way actually. And if we think back to the pandemic and we think about employment services, and I don't know if Minister Carroll's still here, but thinking about the extraordinary work that was undertaken in Jobs Victoria, particularly with people whom even when there's and at the time it was obviously, we had lines that were crawling around the block around, employment services because they thought they would never need help and found that they did. But looking at the Jobs Victoria program, for whom people, even in a strong jobs market, were going to find it hard to get work, there's extraordinary work that was undertaken and actually should be called out and hopefully will be revisited over time. And I'd also call out the public health at that time and thinking of the extraordinary work that took place around vaccinations and a whole host of other things as well. I'd also call out the other areas that we've really seen with the Victorian government, including the Royal Commission into Family Violence, the Royal Commission into Mental Health, the acknowledgement that even before the recommendations were known was that they would all be accepted and that they would all be fully implemented. So I think it's important to name that up and name the wanting. Victoria, I think, is pretty proud of being progressive and wants to be more than up the front of the pack. Obviously within that though there's unfinished business. So whether that's going to the, continuing the recommendations of the Royal Commission and looking at the sort of the maturation in the delivery there and delivering real impact for people and continuing to do that, whether it's about raising the age of criminal responsibility to 14, that we know is still outstanding, concessions reforms, assisting job seekers, those sorts of things. So there's a host of things that the Victorian government has done, is unfinished business and needs to continue to focus on.
Well, that is a very hard list to follow, Emma. That is... Look, if I think about the drivers I was talking about, some that haven't been picked up by Emma, the Victorian government has a lot of levers when it comes to the housing market. And we know there is a big program around affordable housing that the Minister was just referencing. I think that's incredibly important. Really delighted that there will be further investment from the federal government on that front. But a structural solution to housing issues needs to also happen in the private market. And the big lever, of course, is housing supply and allowing, for example, more density in inner and middle ring suburbs that are going to provide the houses that we need to house people. So I think that is a very important long-term lever that sits in the hands of government. At a smaller scale, things like removing impediments to institutional investment in housing, which is really important for building rental properties with security of tenure. And the other very big lever for state governments, of course, is the education system. And we have plenty of ideas about the way in which we can deliver better quality education for students, which is really about changing our economic systems in the long term.
Terrific. Emma, can I come back to you as VCOS head for the peak body for community organisations? What is the role of community organisations and partnering with Victorian government? And can you give us some examples about where you think this is already happening, particularly in a place-based manner, given how much we know and have talked about already, how disadvantage is linked to certain postcodes?
Absolutely. And in terms of, as I think, and the Minister mentioned earlier, it's not something that government can do on its own. And also, obviously, we are collectively stronger when we are all working together as organisations. And one of the tricky things that can be there is often, I think, we're pitched against each other in terms of looking at funding and procurement processes rather than the levers being put in place that actually enable people to collaborate and work together for best advantage of their communities. A couple of things I would draw on. One is a few examples I've seen of late where I think work is being undertaken really well with great empowerment for communities. And then I'll also touch on the listening tour that we've been undertaking around the state. So firstly, I think I was fortunate enough I think it was only about 6 weeks ago, I was up in Morwell, where there's been significant investment by the state government to genuinely empower the local community to drive the changes that the community wants. So remembering, I think one of the things we hear, whether it's the Go Goldfields area, whether it's Morwell, whether it's other parts of Victoria, people do not want government to design things for them and land them at their feet and go, aren't you lucky, we've pre-designed this and here you go. One of the things that really struck me in Morwell, in meeting with the authority and a range of others, of the Health Monitor, but then the Health Assembly, which was a huge array of different people from all parts of the community who came together, were able to tease out their ideas, a number of which had been funded, and they could talk about the differences that it was making within their community. So it was everything from looking at the way they were working with council around the pricing for the leisure centre. There's two differential rates if you want to go into the leisure centre. One is, but you're not asked for evidence. So if you go in and say that you want to pay the lower rate, you just pay the lower rate. You don't have to give a card or provide proof, etc., that you're there. There's no kind of sort of shaming, really. But a whole lot of other community initiatives were happening, and an incredible sense of pride in the community, and pride in a community that's doing it really tough during a period of absolute transition. Another example, which I'll just touch on very briefly, would be Go Goldfields, and again thinking around what they initially decided as 5 outcomes that they wanted to shift in their community, and they were able to show shift in all of those, and they've now come back to really focus on education and literacy and numeracy within the community. And one of the things that struck me when I first visited, which is when I started at VCOS, because I said, I've read all about this, I'm really curious as to how you're making this happen, but others haven't. When I went there and then so I could see it in practice, everyone I spoke to, whether it was a maternal and child health nurse, the police, the people from the local council, the school principal, etc., everyone understood what the priorities were and what their role was in delivering against that. The other thing I'd just touch on is the listening tour we've been doing around the states. We're really mindful that a lot of people, they don't get their voices heard. They don't have the privilege that we all do in sitting on the stage or getting to sit on particular committees, etc. as well. And we wanted to hear directly from people in local communities. So we've joined with different member organisations, including neighbourhood houses, to go and visit local communities and to ask what matters directly to people. 4 key themes came through that I think are really important to kind of lift up and focus on. Loneliness. Loneliness is absolutely profound. It is absolutely profound in every single community that we go to. Digital divide is extraordinary. So many people are locked out of services. So while there were some pros, there were some absolute cons that meant people were kept out, including being kept out of some of the sessions in the beginning because they didn't have a phone. They couldn't show their certificate to be able to get into a session to start with. Access to services more generally, so looking at health, education, etc. And there is one other that's escaped my mind at the moment, which will come back to me shortly. It was cost of living. And a lot of that was when we first started the tour, it was before the war in the Ukraine, before energy prices have escalated to what they are. But the other thing I would say is that people in the local communities all had examples of how they could address the issues for them. And when we asked people what did they want in 5 years' time, one of the things to me that was most striking was that people's aspirations were pretty modest about the things that would make them happy. They wanted friends, they wanted a house, they wanted to be able to be connected to their community. And so I think there's extraordinary potential for how we can work together and the power that's in place.
Danielle, as a member of the Women's Economic Equality Task Force, can you speak to the gender dimension of poverty in Victoria and what can we do about it?
There's a gender dimension in poverty everywhere, I'm afraid to say. And the reason is actually fairly simple, which is that women have much lower lifetime earnings than men on average, which means they have less savings and therefore are just more vulnerable to all of the things that can kind of push you off course in life. We tried to quantify this and we projected forward earnings for an average 25-year-old man and woman today, assuming they went on to have children. There is a $2 million lifetime earnings gap between an average Australian man and woman that has children. And so if you have a child, you have a divorce, you lose your job, women clearly are going to be more vulnerable in those situations. And, we can see that in the statistics. Post-divorce, women leave divorce with less assets, but most importantly, they have much lower lifetime earnings potential because they haven't spent as much time in the workforce as their partner if they've had children. And so 5 years post-divorce, women are much more likely to be showing signs of financial distress than men in the equivalent situation. We see it when it comes to retirement. Women are more represented in the most vulnerable groups, full-rate pensioners that are renting their home. So this tracks across the life course. And I think there's sort of two categories of policy response. One is the acute response that the Minister was referring to. What can government do when one of these situations happens that are pushing women into distress? So things like support for women leaving violent relationships is incredibly important there. What you don't want that is to push someone into poverty and then for that to become entrenched. You want to actually give them the economic supports they need to make that decision and to then set them up to put their life back on track. The other thing is the more sort of structural and systemic changes, which are really go to what can we do and what are the enablers government can provide that are going to help close those income gaps. This is why we have done a lot of work on early learning and care at Grattan. It's important for a number of reasons, but one reason is that it provides support mainly for women who are the ones at the moment who otherwise will be doing that care to participate in the workforce. And those additional hours boost incomes, they boost the earnings trajectory over time, and that can make a really incredible difference to that woman's life and financial vulnerability. So I would also like to recognise the work the Victorian government's done on early learning and care, and I certainly hope the state and federal governments will continue to push and coordinate on that front going forward.
Terrific. Thanks, Danny. Trav, to you, what's BSL's approach to addressing poverty and how does that differ to other organisations, and where do you see the big opportunities emerging to address poverty?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Hutch. And I just want to just call out the work that Grattan and others did on early learning and investment. It really was a huge campaign that involved a lot of organisations, but really did lift the sights and the horizon, not just about what changes in the early childhood system would mean for children, but for parents and especially for women. So well done. BSL's approach, I mean, it kind of, the classic saying, and I can see Mike Tucker in the room, that dates back to Gerard Tucker, was around BSL being the fence at the top of the cliff, not the ambulance at the bottom, and really focusing on how, as an organisation, we can work in partnership to build capability and confidence in the places and situations that those experiencing poverty and disadvantage find themselves. Because, as the Minister said and as Emma has just mentioned, poverty is complex, it's intersectional, and New Zealand have found this because of their legislative measures, some of which go to income, but some of which go to loneliness and exclusion and isolation, and BSL's social exclusion monitor has shown that. I think our approach, Hutch, and you know this better than most, has been most powerful when it's done in partnership. And there are people in this place of different political persuasions that have helped to nurture and grow that work over many years. And a couple of examples of that are our work and learning centres, which do combine education, employment and housing, working particularly with people in social and community housing. I can see Bevan Warner there from Launch Housing, and the foyers are a wonderful example of where you can actually combine approaches that are not just about care and housing, but particularly employment and education pathways. Our Saver Plus program, and I can see Dan Crotty, it's the longest running matched savings program in the world. ANZ and the Federal Department of Social Services are the joint partners, and some wonderful results around building financial wellbeing and resilience. And I can see our children's work there in the HIPPY program, home interaction program for parents and youngsters. It's not a nightclub in Western Australia, the HIPPY Club, but it grew from one site in Fitzroy to 100 sites around Australia. And earlier this week was in Brisbane to meet with the CEOs of what they call the Good Start Syndicate. So in 2009, BSL was part of a syndicate of 4 organisations. It was us, Social Ventures Australia, the Benevolent Society and Mission Australia. And we came together to respond to the collapse of ABC Learning and create Good Start, which is now the biggest early learning provider in the country. But it's those examples, Hutch, of where there has been an audacious idea, a set of partners that can help to deliver it, and can deliver it in a way that focuses on building the confidence and capability of households and communities in the places they are so they can live the life they aspire to. And that's really what the wellbeing framework Emma described is all about. And we need to do much more of that, because it should worry all of us that a country like Australia made the biggest reduction in poverty in the middle of a pandemic. because through the COVID supplement and through the suspension of the worst parts of our income support system, mutual obligation, we lifted more people out of poverty within that 6-month period than ever before. More children, more single parents, and it should worry us that we could make that big leap in the middle of a pandemic, but not as a country set a much stronger course to reduce poverty permanently when we're much happier, healthier, and we can see each other. So that's the challenge for BSL and the challenge for all of us in this place.
Indeed, and speaking of challenges, my last question to you all before I hand over to you as an audience is, if you could ask the Victorian Government to change one policy setting or make one program investment to reduce poverty, Emma, we'll start with you, what would that be?
I'm going to cheat slightly. I would go for the broader piece around, I would adopt a wellbeing economy, and I'd look at indicators that genuinely measure what matters. Knowing that the policy setting will take a little while, which is where I'm cheating, we've got to address housing now, and we have to address food, and we have to address energy.
All right, I'm going to be good and only choose one, Emma. I'm going to choose housing supply because I think that is the important long-term structural change that is going to improve the lives of Victorians over time, because we know that if you don't have secure housing, you're going to find it very challenging to pull yourself out of poverty.
And I'm going to choose employment. Someone said to me last year when I joined BSL that it was born out of helping people into education and employment. Emma mentioned the $670 million investment into Jobs Victoria through the pandemic. We shouldn't stop the work on employment services reform just because unemployment's at 3.5%. This is the opportunity that our country has to find much more fulfilling pathways for careers for those job seekers that have historically been marginalised in the labour market. And Victoria has a way that is much more effective than other jurisdictions, and I would encourage them to stay the course and invest to paint the way for the federal government to follow when it makes its mind up about the future of the National Employment Services system.
Terrific. That's 3 wishes all in one. Thank you very much.
Can you grant them all, Hutch?
All right. It's now over to you as an audience to ask your questions of the panel. Who wants to start? I know you've got a great voice, but...
Thank you. I don't want the answers now, but I'd like us to think about, first of all, statistics, the 13% I've heard, or 1 in 8. But if we divided that up into states and looking at the states' productivity versus the poverty in those states, are they different? Don't answer now, but that might help us. And secondly, I know it's a federal issue, but could Victoria be an advocate to have a variable GST that is applied in different ways for the circumstances of the people?
So a progressive tax rather than...
Well, we won't give it a name yet because...
Sure.
But I think we need to think about it being variable, because some people can afford more, and everybody spends 90% of their income, so why not charge GST on it, whereas other people are spending 110% of their income, don't charge them GST.
Yep, understand. I might start off with Danny because I know you have tax for breakfast.
Love that question. Yes, there is very interesting discussion going on internationally on this question of the idea of a progressive consumption tax. The way you need to do it is to, obviously, you say, people's income, you can look at the amount they save, the difference between is consumption. At the moment, we levy it when people buy, so we can only charge a flat rate, but you can do it in ways through the tax return that sets it at progressive rates. I think it would be a very big tax reform, a very big change, but there is a lot to recommend it. It brings some of the economically good benefits of the consumption tax, but without the regressive quality, which is that it hits lower income people harder. So, look, I think it's a really exciting idea. I am hearing it talked about more and more. I don't know of any jurisdictions which have tried it yet, so we would really be on the cutting edge, but I think I'm very interested to have that conversation. Well, and there is also a broader conversation in a world of high inflation, do we just rely on interest rates in the Reserve Bank, or should we be looking at things like changes in the tax system to slow the economy and to share that burden of slowing the economy and bringing inflation down?
Terrific.
Well, just a quick one. We should have you on the panel, Mark. The data shows Australians want their democracy to improve the lives of others, so they want a strong, fulfilling services system, and there is a gap at the moment between the revenue that sustains those services and what Australians expect. I agree with Danny. I think there needs to be reconsideration of the balance of tax and transfer around land, labour, wealth, consumption, externalities like the environment. And unless we do that, we won't be able to sustain the sorts of services that Australians expect and that we're going to need if we're serious about poverty reduction.
Just to reiterate, in terms of we need to grow the pie, the other thing I would just talk about, which I know isn't strictly to your question, but it's one of my bugbears, and that's when it goes to things like fines and looking at other jurisdictions where you pay more if you earn more. And I think there's some other things that we can look at more broadly as well that go to the general tenets around what is fairness. I look at the number of people who are literally locked up because they can't afford to pay their fines, and there's a big difference if you're getting job seeker to if you're earning $300,000 a year to if you incur a $200 fine for something.
Thanks, Emma. Next question. Bevan?
Sometimes I hear the hip pocket nerve invoked by commentators to describe a voting pattern that prioritises me first, and presumably other people take a we the community approach to electoral politics. I'm wondering whether panel members think it is, me or we, a binary opposite, and how we should think about that in terms of policy and advocacy.
Yeah, so just to make sure, so in terms of looking at that individualism as opposed to looking at the collective piece, I think it's really interesting, and we've seen it play out more recently. So if I think around the state budget, when the property tax for if you've got more than one property came in, and watching the commentary after that in terms of people who are fortunate enough, and I have a very strong view around this, which I've had a lot of feedback on, not all positive. Because I think for people who are fortunate enough to own a second property, that there is an ability to contribute more and contribute back. So how do we actually grow our wealth? But it's been interesting to me to watch this groundswell of people going, how dare you ask us to contribute more? Like, we want all of these things, but we don't want to actually have to pay for it, when we know that there are other people who can't even find a place to rent. When we look at the Anglicare study around rental affordability, etc. So I think there's this really interesting part actually about how we have a much more mature and sophisticated debate around how do we improve our society, how do we do better for all, and also how do we grow the pie? So if we want to deliver everything that we can, and I think a really great example of that, going back to the examples that were mentioned by the Minister and by yourselves, when I think back to when I was a CEO of Early Learning Association Australia, and we were looking to advocate for 3-year-old kindergarten at the time, and we were literally told that we were dreaming, but we knew that if you could bring in high quality early childhood education that was affordable and accessible for every child, you would change their life trajectory, which had not only better outcomes for children, but for their entire life trajectory, let alone women, etc. I think, so we've seen some movement in that space, but it's really interesting, I think, in some of the debates that play out about the deserving and the undeserving. So I think there's much more maturity and sophistication that needs to come to that discussion as well.
Indeed. Thank you. Trevor or Danielle, do you want to add to that?
I'm willing to believe there's more we than me, both in this place and around the community. I think we saw a lot of that through the pandemic, and in meetings with new parliamentarians here right across the board, a strong desire to improve the wellbeing of all. It does mean there are some trickier conversations, Bevan, about what that looks like in practice, particularly when cost of living pressures are impacting everyone, right? We're seeing all these fixed mortgages about to roll. What I think we need to do, though, is to, and we've talked about this a lot at BSL, is that there's still an issue in Australia where we have the conversation around poverty and disadvantage is still an over there conversation, as opposed to this is all of us conversation, and it's not seen through the economic lens that it should be, which is this is, for the country, a huge missed opportunity to really invest in better approaches so that we can have more Australians leading prosperous, fulfilling lives and contributing to the country in the way that they are already doing but could contribute much more. And I think until we relocate that conversation and make it about all of us, the we conversation, we'll still be having these gatherings where we're talking about that 13%.
Look, I think there is a tendency to underestimate the Australian people in the discussion. And, when I look at support for various reforms that would hurt people's hip pockets, if we look at tax changes that have been proposed, things like negative gearing, changing the stage 3 tax cuts, super tax concessions, if you actually go and look at the polling for all of those things, they're actually popular. More than 50% of people in the electorate support them, and they tend to be particularly popular amongst the higher income people that are going to be hit by that. I think many people would be surprised by that, and I think there is a difference between the very sort of shouty public conversation that gets played out in the media and the squeaky wheels versus what your average Australian actually thinks. And many people that will be impacted are willing to pay more if it is going to the sort of services and supports that they value. So I think there is actually a lot of we out there. I think we just need to do more to make that visible because I think when you appeal to the better angels of people's nature, they do want to make a contribution and they are willing to. That doesn't mean everyone, and you will definitely get some screaming, and I get angry phone calls all the time. But overall, I think many people do have that more collectivist mindset.
Sure.
So the other thing I just was thinking is I do think there's an element in the framing of the conversation as well, which is partly why I love the wellbeing economy framework, because I think it resonates much more strongly with people and it gets out of the otherwise negative space we're in. So that to me is one of the key things around if we focus on wellbeing economy, it's pretty hard to argue against, and most people get it. I think in terms of when we look at things potentially like a future generations commissioner, which is what Wales have around going, actually, how do we make our society a better place for future generations? When we're in those conversations, you can really feel the discussion shift.
Terrific, thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time we've got for in terms of audience question. Thanks for being an engaged audience. Some would argue that there are some more important questions that need to be answered in other parts of this building with question time about to start in the Legislative Assembly. In the hope that you too found today's conversation as insightful as I did, can I ask you to please join me in thanking our panellists, VCOS's Emma King, Grattan Institute's Danielle Wood and BSL's Trav McLeod. My BSL colleagues and parliamentary staff behind the scenes on audio, video and marketing who've helped me put this panel on. Thank you. And if you only joined in halfway or want to hear the discussion again, riveting bedtime listening, the recording will be out in the next week. If you didn't RSVP and you need to subscribe to our email list, and the QR code will come up on the screen magically. And finally, we're accepting donations to our op shops and having a competition between lower house MPs in that bin and upper house MPs in that bin. So I really encourage the lower house MPs in the audience, so I see Will Fowles and Bronwyn Halfpenny, to lift your game in terms of donations so we have full boxes by the end of this week. Thank you everyone for your support of the Brotherhood of St Lawrence and for being here today. Thanks very much.